What if I told you that some of my most important words were never meant for public eyes? What if the letters I wrote in private to friends, to colleagues, to lovers revealed a completely different person than the Einstein you think you know? And what if powerful institutions, governments, and even my own family tried to keep these letters hidden, buried, suppressed? Stay with me, because today I'm going to share the contents of letters that were locked away for decades, letters that reveal my deepest doubts, my political views that made me enemies, my private struggles, and the truths I could only express when I thought no one was watching. And I promise you, what you're about to discover will completely change how you see me. Because the public Einstein, the friendly genius with wild hair, that was a character, a mask, and in these letters you'll meet the real me. My name is Albert Einstein, and I wrote thousands of letters during my lifetime. To scientists discussing physics, to politicians arguing for peace, to friends sharing my thoughts on everything from philosophy to music, to women I loved expressing feelings I couldn't show publicly. And many of these letters, perhaps the most revealing ones, were sealed, hidden, kept from public view for 20, 50, even 70 years after my death. Some by my own instruction, some by recipients who feared what they contained, some by institutions that didn't want the world to know what I really thought. But now, decades later, these letters have emerged, been published, been analyzed, and they paint a picture that's far more complex, more troubling, more human than the sanitized image you know. Today, I'm going to take you through some of these letters, the controversial ones, the painful ones, the ones that reveal truths I kept hidden. And I'm going to explain why they were suppressed, what they reveal, and what they tell us about the gap between public image and private reality. Let me start with the letters that caused the most controversy, the ones to Mileva marriage, my first wife. These letters were written during our courtship and early marriage, and they were kept private by my family for decades after my death. Why? Because they revealed things about me that didn't fit the narrative, things that were uncomfortable, embarrassing, damaging to my reputation. In these letters, you see a young man deeply in love, passionate, tender. I wrote to Mileva about physics, yes, but also about my feelings, my dreams of our future together, my excitement about starting a life with her. But you also see something else. You see possessiveness, jealousy, a need to control. In one letter from 1901, I wrote to Mileva, "You should not work at all, so you are entirely mine, my little treasure." This sounds romantic, perhaps, but read it carefully. So you are entirely mine, not so we can spend time together, not because I want to support you, but so that she would belong to me, be my possession. This was the beginning of a pattern that would destroy our marriage. In another letter, I discussed our daughter, Liesel, the child born before we were married, the child I never met. And my words are chilling in their detachment. I asked about her health, about whether she was well, but there's no emotion, no longing to see her, no anguish about being separated from my child, just practical questions. And then, later letters, she's simply never mentioned again, as if she ceased to exist, as if she didn't matter. My family suppressed these letters because they showed that I had abandoned the child, that I had prioritized my career, my reputation, over my own daughter. And that's not the image of Einstein the world wanted. Einstein the humanitarian, Einstein the loving father figure. The letters contradicted that image, so they were hidden. But here's what troubles me most about those letters. Not just what they reveal about my treatment of Mileva and Liesel, but what they reveal about how we construct public images, about how the people we celebrate are often far more flawed than we acknowledge, about how institutions protect legacies by hiding uncomfortable truths. My family didn't suppress these letters out of malice. They were protecting my reputation, protecting the Einstein brand, if you will. Because Einstein had become more than a person. I had become a symbol of genius, of wisdom, of moral authority. And symbols can't have abandoned daughters, can't have failed marriages, can't have feet of clay. So the letters were sealed, and for decades people believed in the symbol, not the man. But symbols are lies, or at least partial truths. And when you suppress the full truth, you're not honoring someone's legacy, you're distorting it. You're creating an idol instead of acknowledging a human being. And that serves no one, not me, not the people who look up to me, not history. So I'm glad these letters eventually came out. I'm glad the full picture emerged, because I'd rather be remembered as a flawed human who did some good things than as a plaster saint who never existed. Let me tell you about another set of letters that were controversial. The ones I wrote about politics, about war and peace, about socialism and capitalism, about Palestine and Israel. These letters made powerful people very uncomfortable, and some were actively suppressed, not by my family, but by governments, by institutions, by people who didn't want my views known. In 1949, I wrote an essay called Why Socialism? It was published in the first issue of Monthly Review, a socialist magazine. In it, I argued that capitalism creates artificial scarcity, that it concentrates wealth and power, that it turns humans into commodities, and I advocated for a planned economy, for democratic socialism, for a system that prioritizes human welfare over profit. This created problems for me. This was the beginning of the Cold War. America was gripped by anti-communist hysteria, and here was Einstein, the most famous scientist in the world, advocating for socialism. The FBI was already watching me. They had been since the 1930s. They had a file on me over 1,000 pages long, tracking my political activities, my associations, my statements. They considered me a security risk, a potential subversive. And after Why Socialism, the surveillance intensified. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, wanted me deported, actually tried to build a case to have my citizenship revoked, called me a communist sympathizer, an enemy of America. And many of my letters from this period, letters to friends discussing politics, were intercepted, read, filed away. Some were leaked to the press to embarrass me. Others were kept secret to avoid making me a martyr. But the message was clear. Speak too loudly about politics, and there will be consequences. Now, I wasn't intimidated. I kept speaking out, kept writing letters to newspapers, to politicians, to anyone who would listen, arguing against nuclear weapons, against McCarthyism, against the arms race. But I also became more careful, more strategic. Some of my most radical views I kept to private letters. Letters I trusted wouldn't be intercepted, or at least wouldn't be published during my lifetime. In one letter to a friend in 1953, I wrote, "I believe that the abominable deterioration of ethical standards stems primarily from the mechanization and depersonalization of our lives. We are turning into machines ourselves, and machines have no souls." This was more than politics. This was philosophy, a critique of modernity itself, of industrial capitalism, of the dehumanization I saw accelerating around me. But I couldn't say this publicly, not in that political climate. I would have been crucified, called anti-progress, anti-American. So I kept it private, shared it only with people I trusted, and the letters remained hidden for decades, only published long after the Cold War ended, when it was safe, when it couldn't hurt me or be used against me.
This is what I mean by letters they didn't want you to read. Not dramatic secrets, not scandals, but views that didn't fit the acceptable narrative, that challenged power, that made people uncomfortable. And so they were suppressed, hidden, kept from public view until the political climate changed. Let me tell you about my letters regarding Israel and Palestine. These are perhaps the most sensitive, the most carefully guarded, because my views were complex, nuanced, and easily misrepresented by people with agendas on both sides. I was a Jew. I supported the idea of a Jewish homeland. I helped raise money for the Hebrew University. I was offered the presidency of Israel. So people assume I was an uncritical Zionist, a supporter of Israel no matter what. But my letters tell a different story.
In a letter to Chaim Weizmann in 1929, after Arab-Jewish riots in Palestine, I wrote, "Should we be unable to find a way to honest cooperation and honest pacts with the Arabs, then we have learned absolutely nothing during our 2,000 years of suffering." I was warning against the exclusion of Arabs, against the idea that we could build a Jewish state without genuinely partnering with the Arab population. And in another letter, in 1946, I wrote even more strongly, I would much rather see reasonable agreement with the Arabs on the basis of living together in peace than the creation of a Jewish state. My awareness of the essential nature of Judaism resists the idea of a Jewish state with borders, an army, and a measure of temporal power. I am afraid of the inner damage Judaism will sustain. Read that again. I said I was afraid of what statehood would do to Judaism itself, that having borders and armies and power would damage the essential nature of Jewish identity and values. This was not a popular view, not among Zionists, not among people working to establish Israel. And so these letters were downplayed, kept quiet, not suppressed exactly, but not publicized either, because they complicated the narrative, because they showed that Einstein's views didn't fit neatly into any political box. And after Israel was established, I continued to write letters expressing concern about the treatment of Arabs, about the militarization, about the growing nationalism. In a letter in 1952, I criticized the Israeli government's policies, called for better treatment of Arab citizens, warned against becoming the oppressors we had once been victims of. These letters were not published widely. Some recipients kept them private out of respect for me. Others kept them private because they feared the controversy. And institutions that held my papers, they were careful about which letters they made accessible, which ones they highlighted in exhibitions and publications. The easy letters, the ones that showed Einstein, the humanitarian, the wise elder statesman, those were publicized. The complicated letters, the ones that might spark political debate or division, those were quietly filed away. This is how historical narratives are shaped, not usually through outright suppression, but through selective emphasis, through choosing what to highlight and what to downplay. And the result is a distorted picture, a simplified version of a complex person. Let me tell you about letters of a different kind, personal letters, love letters, letters to women who were not my wives. These were suppressed for obvious reasons, to protect reputations, to avoid scandal, to maintain the image of Einstein, the respectable family man. But they existed, and they reveal a side of me that was passionate, sometimes reckless, often selfish in my pursuit of connection. I had relationships outside my marriages, affairs, some brief, some sustained over years, and I wrote letters to these women, letters that were intimate, vulnerable, sometimes manipulative. I don't share this to boast or to shock, but to be honest about who I was, about the gap between my public image and private behavior. I preached about ethics, about integrity, about moral responsibility, but in my personal life I often failed to live up to these ideals. I hurt people, betrayed trust, justified my behavior with rationalizations about unconventional relationships and personal freedom. And the letters I wrote to these women, they show all of this, the passion, the justifications, the rationalizations, the selfishness. My family, understandably, wanted these letters kept private. Some of the women involved or their families also wanted privacy. So most of these letters were sealed, some destroyed, others locked away with instructions not to open them until everyone involved was long dead. But some have emerged, been published in academic collections, and they paint an uncomfortable picture. They show that I was capable of great tenderness, of deep feeling, of real connection, but also that I compartmentalized ruthlessly, that I could write passionate letters to a lover in the morning and go home to my wife in the evening without apparent guilt, that I prioritized my emotional needs over the harm I was causing. Why am I telling you this? Because it matters. Because when we hide the full humanity of historical figures, we create impossible standards. We make people believe that greatness requires perfection, that you can't contribute something meaningful to the world if you're also flawed, messy, complicated in your personal life. And that's a damaging lie. It prevents people from trying, from pursuing their potential, because they think, I'm not perfect like Einstein, so I can't do great things. But I wasn't perfect, far from it. I was brilliant in some ways and deeply flawed in others, and that's the truth. That's what these suppressed letters reveal. Not that I was a monster, but that I was human. Complicated, capable of both insight and blindness, both genius and selfishness.
Now let me tell you about letters that I suppressed myself, letters I wrote but chose not to send, or sent with instructions to destroy, or sealed with instructions not to publish until long after my death. These are perhaps the most revealing, because they show what I was afraid to say publicly, what I only trusted to paper, what I wanted hidden. I wrote many letters that I never sent, drafts, attempts to express things I ultimately decided were too dangerous, too controversial, too revealing to actually communicate. Some of these drafts survived, found in my papers after my death, and they show my unfiltered thoughts. In one unsent letter from 1933, after I had fled Germany, I wrote about my hatred of German nationalism, of the German people who had enabled Hitler's rise. It was bitter, angry, unforgiving, and I didn't send it because I knew it would be used against me, would be seen as anti-German prejudice, would undermine my moral authority. So I wrote it, let myself feel the anger, express it on paper, and then I put it away, unsent. In another unsent letter from the 1940s, I wrote about my doubts regarding physics, about whether my approach to the unified field theory was fundamentally wrong, about whether I had wasted decades pursuing a dead end. This vulnerability, this admission of possible failure, I couldn't make it public, couldn't even share it with most colleagues. So I wrote it to myself, a letter to no one, a confession to the void, and it stayed in my desk drawer, found after I died. These unsent letters, they're like a diary, a record of thoughts too raw, too uncertain, too dangerous to share, and they're invaluable because they show the internal process, the doubts behind the public confidence, the fears behind the assured exterior. They humanize me in a way the published work never could. But I also sealed certain letters deliberately, wrote them, sent them, but with explicit instructions, not to be opened until X years after my death. I did this with some letters to close friends, letters where I expressed views I knew would be controversial, where I admitted things I was ashamed of, where I was fully honest in a way I couldn't be publicly. One such letter, sealed for 50 years, was to a physicist friend. In it, I admitted that I regretted spending so much time on the unified field theory, that I should have engaged more with quantum mechanics, tried to understand it instead of fighting it, that my stubbornness had cost me my relevance in physics. This admission, this regret, I couldn't make it while I was alive. It would have undermined everything I was working on, would have made me look foolish, like an old man who had lost his way. So I sealed it, let it be known after I was gone, when it couldn't hurt my ongoing work, but could perhaps serve as a lesson to others. Don't be so rigid. Don't get so attached to your approach that you can't adapt. Don't let pride keep you from learning. These sealed letters, they were my attempt to speak to the future, to share truths I couldn't share with my present, to be honest in a way that was only safe posthumously. And now, decades later, they're being read, being analyzed, being integrated into the full picture of who I was. And that's as it should be. That's what I intended. Delayed honesty, truth on a timer. Let me tell you about letters that reveal my spiritual views, my thoughts on God, on religion, on the meaning of existence. These were often misrepresented during my lifetime, and some letters were suppressed because they contradicted what people wanted to believe about my beliefs. Religious people wanted to claim me, wanted to say that Einstein believed in God, that even the greatest scientific mind acknowledged a creator, and they would quote selectively from my published statements, things I said about cosmic religious feeling, about the beauty of the universe, about not believing God plays dice, but they ignored the full context, ignored the letters where I was more explicit. In a letter to philosopher Eric Gutkind in 1954, just a year before I died, I wrote, "The word God is for me nothing more than the expression and product of human weaknesses, the Bible a collection of honorable but still primitive legends, which are nevertheless pretty childish." This letter was kept private by the recipient, not published until decades later. Why? Because it was explosive. It showed that I was not a believer, not in any traditional sense, that I rejected the God of religion, rejected revealed religion entirely.
When this letter finally came to light, religious people were shocked, offended. Some said it was a forgery, others said I didn't really mean it. But I did. That was my honest view. God, as conceived by religions, was a human creation, a projection. And the Bible, while containing wisdom, was not divine, was not literal truth. This view made me unpopular with many people, made me seem cold, arrogant. How dare Einstein dismiss billions of people's faith? But I wasn't dismissing faith, I was rejecting dogma, rejecting the idea that we need ancient texts or religious authorities to tell us how to live or what to believe. I had my own spirituality, my cosmic religious feeling, my sense of awe at the order and beauty of the universe. But it wasn't religious in any conventional sense. And the letters where I explained this, where I was explicit about my atheism, or at least my agnosticism, these were often kept private, because they were controversial, because they didn't fit what people wanted me to be. I received thousands of letters from religious people during my life, rabbis, priests, regular believers, asking me about God, about whether science proved or disproved religion. And I usually responded diplomatically, politely, with vague statements that could be interpreted multiple ways. But in private letters to close friends, I was more blunt. Religion is wish fulfillment, a crutch for those who can't face the universe's indifference. A source of comfort, yes, but also a source of division and irrational thinking. These views expressed privately were kept private, sometimes by the recipients, sometimes by me, asking them not to share, because I didn't want to become a symbol of atheism, didn't want that fight. I had enough fights, politics, physics, personal life. I didn't need a religious war too. So I managed my public image carefully, let people believe what they wanted about my beliefs, and kept the full truth in private letters, to be discovered later, or not. It didn't matter. What mattered was preserving my ability to work, to think, to contribute, without being consumed by controversy over religion. Let me ask you something now, because I'm genuinely curious. Do you think historical figures have a right to privacy? Do you think letters marked private or not to be published should be respected? Or do you think once someone becomes a public figure, especially someone as influential as I became, that all their writings belong to history? That the public has a right to know everything? This is not an easy question. I struggled with it myself. On one hand, I valued privacy. I wanted spaces where I could be fully honest without worrying about public reaction, where I could express doubts, fears, controversial views without being judged by millions. And I think everyone deserves that, some realm of privacy, some place where you're not performing for an audience. But on the other hand, I was a public figure. My work influenced history. My views shaped public discourse. And hiding those views, or selectively revealing only the palatable ones, that distorts history. That creates a false narrative. So where's the line? I don't know, but I want to hear what you think. Leave a comment below. Tell me whether you think my private letters should have been published, whether my family and institutions were right to suppress some of them, whether privacy matters more than historical truth, or whether historical figures forfeit privacy by accepting public influence. This is important because it's not just about me. It's about how we construct history, how we remember people, how we decide what matters and what can be forgotten. Let me tell you about one final category of letters, the ones I wrote near the end of my life, in my 70s, when I knew my time was limited, when I had the clarity that comes with approaching death. These letters are the most honest, the most reflective, the most free of pretense, because what did I have to lose? In letters to old friends, I expressed regret about my failed marriages, about neglecting my children, about spending so much energy on physics and so little on relationships. I wrote to Hans Albert, my son, trying to apologize, trying to explain, trying to make some kind of peace before I died. It was awkward, insufficient, too little, too late, but I tried. And those letters, they're painful to read, because they show an old man realizing, finally, what he had sacrificed, what he had lost, what he could never get back. Some of these letters were published, others remain private, held by my descendants. But even the published ones didn't get much attention, because they didn't fit the narrative. Einstein, the genius, having regrets? Einstein admitting failure in his personal life? That's not inspiring. That's not the story people want. But it's the truth. It's the most important truth these letters contain, that success in one area doesn't compensate for failure in others, that being brilliant doesn't make you wise, that understanding the universe doesn't mean you understand yourself or the people you love. And these final letters, these expressions of regret and recognition, they're my real legacy. Not the equations, not the theories, but the human lesson, the warning. Don't do what I did. Don't sacrifice everything for your work. Don't assume there will be time later to make things right. Don't let your ego convince you that your contribution to humanity excuses your failures as a human being. That's what these letters say. That's the message I was trying to leave. But it's a message that was largely suppressed, downplayed, ignored, because it's not what people wanted to hear from Einstein. They wanted inspiration, wisdom, genius, not regret, not failure, not humanity. But humanity is what these letters reveal, in all its complexity, all its contradiction, all its mess. Let me tell you why these letters matter, why they should be read, why suppressing them, hiding them, keeping them private, that serves no one. First, because truth matters. History should be accurate, complete, not sanitized, not selective. If we only remember the good parts of people, if we hide the flaws and failures, we're lying. We're creating mythology, not history. And mythology, while inspiring, is ultimately hollow. It doesn't teach us anything real, because real people are complicated. Real people fail. Real people hurt others, even while doing great things. And if we hide that, if we pretend it doesn't exist, we're not honoring anyone's legacy. We're distorting it. Second, because these letters teach us things the public work never could. They teach us about the human cost of genius, about the toll of single-minded focus, about the way brilliance in one area can coexist with blindness in another. They teach us that we need balance, that relationships matter, that presence matters, that being fully human requires attending to more than just our work, or our passion, or our contribution. And these are lessons I learned too late, but you don't have to. You can learn from my letters, from my mistakes, from my regrets.
Third, because suppressing uncomfortable truths protects no one. It doesn't protect my reputation, because the truth comes out eventually. It always does. And when it does, the suppression looks worse than the truth itself. It looks like hiding, like shame, like dishonesty. Better to be forthright, to admit complexity, to say, yes, Einstein was brilliant and also deeply flawed. Yes, he contributed enormously to science and also failed his family. Yes, he was both of those things. That's honest, that's real, and that's what people need to hear. And fourth, because these letters connect us. When you read about my doubts, my fears, my regrets, you see yourself. You see that everyone struggles, everyone makes mistakes, everyone wishes they had done some things differently. And that's comforting, that's humanizing. It makes my achievements feel more accessible. Because if even Einstein was a mess in his personal life, if even Einstein had regrets and doubts and failures, then maybe I can still do meaningful work despite my own flaws. Maybe perfection isn't required. Maybe just being human and trying is enough. That's what these suppressed letters teach, and that's why they should be read. Now, I want to be clear about something. Not all suppression was malicious. Not all secrecy was about hiding scandals. Some letters were kept private out of respect for other people involved, to protect their privacy, to avoid causing them pain. And that's legitimate. That's ethical. If I wrote a letter discussing someone else's private struggles, someone else's secrets, they have a right to keep that private, even if I'm a historical figure, even if scholars want access. There are limits. And some letters were sealed at my own request, not because I was ashamed, but because I thought certain ideas needed time to breathe, needed to be considered in a different context, a different era, when they could be understood without the baggage of the moment I lived in. And that's also legitimate, that's thoughtful. Delayed publication isn't always suppression. Sometimes it's strategy, sometimes it's wisdom. But what troubles me is the selective suppression, the choosing to hide some things while publicizing others based on what protects or enhances a reputation. That's dishonest, that's manipulation,
And it happened with my letters. It happens with many historical figures. The institutions that control the archives, they have enormous power. Power to shape how people are remembered, and that power is often used to create a narrative, a simplified, palatable version of a person. And the letters that don't fit that narrative, they're downplayed, kept in boxes that researchers have to specifically request, not digitized, not publicized, technically available, but practically hidden. This is how history gets distorted, not through outright lies, but through emphasis and omission, through choosing what to highlight and what to bury. And it means that most people's understanding of historical figures, including me, is partial at best, based on curated selections, not the full picture.
So, what's the solution? I don't have a perfect answer, but I think we need more transparency, more willingness to present the full, complicated truth, more acceptance that our heroes are human, flawed, contradictory, and that that's okay, that doesn't diminish their contributions. If anything, it makes their achievements more remarkable, because they did great things despite their flaws, not because they were perfect, but because they were human and kept trying anyway. That's the real story. That's what these letters reveal, and that's what I hope you take away from this. Not that Einstein was secretly terrible, not that all historical figures are frauds, but that everyone is complicated. Everyone has private thoughts that differ from their public persona. Everyone has regrets and failures alongside successes. And acknowledging that, understanding that, it doesn't diminish anyone. It humanizes them, makes them real, makes their example more useful, because we can learn from the whole person, not just the polished image. Let me tell you about one last letter, one I wrote shortly before I died, to a young student who had written asking for advice. And this letter, unlike so many others, I wanted published. I wanted it shared, because it contained what I had finally learned, what I wished I had known when I was young. I wrote, "The important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existence. One cannot help but be in awe when contemplating the mysteries of eternity, of life, of the marvelous structure of reality. It is enough if one tries merely to comprehend a little of this mystery each day. Never lose a holy curiosity. But do not forget, do not ever forget, that the mystery includes the people around you. That understanding equations is meaningless if you do not understand the human heart. That solving problems in physics is worth nothing if you cannot solve the problems in your own life. I learned this too late. Do not make the same mistake." That's what I wanted my legacy to be. Not just the science, but the warning, the human lesson, the recognition that I had failed in crucial ways and that others should learn from my failure. But that letter, that final piece of advice, it got less attention than the equations, less attention than the theories, because it wasn't what people wanted from Einstein. They wanted genius, not humility, not regret, not humanity. But humanity is what I had to offer at the end, and humanity is what these letters contain. All of them. The suppressed ones, the controversial ones, the private ones, the sealed ones. They're all pieces of the full picture of who I really was. Not the symbol, not the icon, but the man. Flawed, complicated, brilliant in some ways and blind in others. That's the truth. That's what these letters reveal. And that's why they matter. Because the truth always matters, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's not what people want to hear. The truth is what we owe each other, what we owe history, what we owe ourselves. And these letters, finally emerging from decades of suppression and secrecy, they're telling the truth, the whole truth, about me, about genius, about the cost of achievement, about being human. And that truth, uncomfortable as it is the most valuable thing I can give you. Hit subscribe to uncover more hidden truths from history